1분 정도만 후에 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 저는 크리스토퍼 교수님께서 패널을 진행해 주시겠습니다.
Well, thank you all very much for staying until the end of what's been a very interesting, stimulating day. We have discussed a lot of fault lines, and right now we're going to explore different potential solutions. One of the reasons all of us are here is that we have the privilege in working with Seoul National University under the leadership of Professor Yin and Professor Pa on a research project supported by the Korean National Research Foundation, trying to study a different mode of governing AI through standards. And one of the things that we're exploring, we've spent a lot of time talking about the Korean AI Act and about the EU AI Act. And this panel was going to explore an alternative solution, an approach to regulating AI. It's not as much driven by governments, but rather by standards development. And so with that, we'll start the conversation going, but as a matter of introduction, I'd like to start with you, Professor Hermans. What is a standard?
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Yong, and thank you, everyone, for sticking around. And I like how you have framed this question and this discussion as potential solution, because I'm going to start by suggesting that there's a lot of confusion around the concept of standards. In fact, there are fault lines inherent in the concept of standards, because everyone talks about we need AI standards, we want AI standards, and most folks, I think, when they're talking about AI standards, they don't have a clear understanding of what standard is, and that's because there are lots of different potential meanings of this concept. So I'll just briefly outline a couple of different categorizations of standards. So I'll try not to get into examples in the interest of time, but probably the most general categorization is formal versus informal standards. Formal standards, we all get together through some mechanism and say, this is how we're going to do something. Informal, we don't go through that process, but by some organic process, we come to a tacit agreement that this is how we're all going to do our industry or behavior or whatever. Another common categorization of standards is voluntary versus de jure, or mandatory versus adaptive. And this deals with why people follow these standards. So voluntary standards, there might be even alternate standards, there might be a standard setting organization or some group that comes to develop a standard down the world, and you don't need to sign on to that. follow the standard as a condition of operating business, operating industry. And then the back of the standard, there is no mandatory requirement. There might not even be a defined standard out there, but we all happen to walk on the left side of the street or the right side of the street without rules saying do this, against that, how we do it. Under the category of majority standards or mandatory standards, we can have subcategories. We can have explicit standards. So, for instance, a law could say you have to drive a certain speed, or the Federal Communications Commission in the United States. They define a communication channel for the cable television system as 6 megahertz. So that is what a channel on a cable television system needs to be, 6 megahertz. Other times it might be by. So in the United States, in most jurisdictions, you need to, if you're building a new building or doing electrical work, you have to follow some version of the National Electrical Code. And in case by reference, you need to do this, some external organization defines what that is. So again, you have different categories. Another really important categorization, and I think it's possibly the most important for the discussion around artificial intelligence, is technical versus process versus compliance standards. So technical standards say this is how you have to design your system. This is how you have to do red teaming, how you have to do security. These are the technical requirements for how you design or implement your system. We frequently see these with interoperability requirements, for instance. Process-based standards don't get into technical elements. They say these are the steps you need to go through when you are designing your. These are the transparency obligations that you have to have. We're not going to tell you what information you put out there, but you need to do something, some amount of testing that you can certify. Then compliance standards, these are similar to process, but it's less about how you design your system. It's more about steps that you must go through that you can check off before you're allowed to operate. And we don't care what you're doing, we care that you're doing. The last categorization that I'll put out there, which I think again we align over frequently in discussions, is the purpose of the standards is to determine whether your system will be allowed to operate. That is it legal to use your system versus liability standards? How are we going to determine whether your system is something wrong when something?
So it's a very complicated analysis, but I'll try to give you one very simple example. I'm sort of holding my phone right hand. Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is a standard created by an organization called IEEE, it's a private organization, and it's a communication standard. It used to be the government, big organizations like the International Telecommunication Union would create communication standards, and it mandated the government was mandated that everyone uses them, and uses it, adopt a standard for communicating. But the most interesting thing about this was that Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And if you look at the old studies, the advocates of the day, they thought that Bluetooth would be this great technology that everyone would be using, and Wi-Fi would be this little tiny niche communication standard. And they were all created by private entities with multi-stakeholder participation. But it turns out Wi-Fi is the dominant standard, not because anyone told us to, but because we all voluntarily adopted it as users, as producers, and it's a different modality. Instead of the government ordering everyone to do it a certain way, you allow multiple organizations to propose different standards, and then we see in the marketplace, the decentralized basis, why, which one actually needs to. And so what we see is different approaches, technically, and different compositions of how we design it. And to a certain extent, there's a tendency to think of standards as this wonderful panacea. You hear this in certain areas, like in a lot of areas we work in, they talk about public-private partnerships. We're supposed to think, oh, that means everyone's together, it solves all of our problems. But what we're discovering is just by calling something a public-private partnership, it doesn't really solve everything. And so what kind of public-private partnership? How the decisions are made? How the voting is? So I know in a lot of discussions, we devoted several years of our lives to studying how standards would work. But I guess the question is there something magic about standards? Just put it in this private decision making and everything's going to work out better. So I'm saying, well, should we just say, okay, by calling it a standard that solves all our problems, let's go home and
Like that.
Obviously, yes, standards are magic, they can solve more problems. No, of course not. I think there are benefits to that there are some benefits and pluralism that can flexibly use that, where we potentially have competition between different standards. We say, oh, you're this expert, solve industry, society, academia, all kind of go across the thing. What actually works, not what makes it go along this heavy long process once every several. There's a benefit to this flexibility. There's also real risk that comes precisely from that kind of magical standards as this pervading marketing techniques, which is it's easy to follow off the process on standards with the assumption that we will get something out. And it's easy to say, oh, I think here back to when I'm moderating for earlier, where there's this big shift in the general rhetoric about AI from we're going to regulate for this, we're going to regulate. And one way you could say also just regulate for innovation, say rather than heavy-handed regulation, instead we'll let it develop standards to provide standards. But that doesn't change the content of the standards. It doesn't make those standards are great, really great in protecting privacy and really wonderful about making sure that there is discrimination and everyone is taking it only. Or maybe we say, okay, we're going to make the standards and issues and institutions that follow along, or we have a code of conduct that says it will be great if our prices want to stay on the bottom. And we're going to call that the standard for privacy for protection. Now, I think that's obviously going too far, but I think it's so really that when we determine something over the standards process, we imagine that process will come out in a useful outcome that will serve the government of the city, and it needs to have more useful than legislation.
Well, it's we also see the benefits of standardizing things in some ways. For those of us who remember what it was like buying a printer before the USB cable came along, there were 13 pin pictures cables, there were 17 pin cables, there were all kinds of different things. Now we have a more uniform standard that we can get away with the same thing. But as you point out, it's not most standards they're badly designed, and just because people can pick doesn't mean that we're actually creating good ones. So many of them languish. It's not obvious by having the standard. Now, I know in our prior conversation with this, we're talking about the role of standards as harmonization internationally. Because one of the issues we have is, well, Korea has one approach, Europe has one approach, the US one approach. We know there's standards to be bad. How can this help us?
Yeah, the different regions have very different agenda and goals. For example, the EU focuses on human rights protection as well as different single market strategies. And further discuss the Trump administration recent American AI plan, focuses on expanding American AI capabilities to the overall AI effects to other allies and partners. And for Korea, we are still wrestling on how to in which direction we should go, and there are a lot of different things. Well, I think, amid such kind of implementations and kind of disobeying. I think the important thing is for us to have a minimum system of the temple life. I think that is also related to the future of complexity and AI institute or security institute. And I think that the worst idea of complexity would have formal kind of decentralized based on international standards interoperability, and based on that, everything becomes consensus. We admit that different standards can compete with each other, and then that is probably based on the market mechanism or some more cooperation can reach a better and better future based on interoperability. So I think based on such kind of standards, maybe probably can address the problems of different local fragmentation and have better governance centralized.
So, if I may just review, in our conversation, we also talked about the timing of adoption. So we have how do standards work in a technology that's going through organic, dynamic change technologically? Are these a better approach? Are they a worse approach? Particularly compared to a legal approach, which is our main option.
So a positive spin on standards, like on the second trying to follow in business itself. If standards were to provide that additional flexibility, and the capability to evolve, unlike law, if that were the case, then standards would probably be an improvement on the current legal regime, because the current legal regime often it's difficult to amend, and there's it's an adjudicated system, there's penalties, etc. And definitely everybody is realizing that okay, some things we have to do the law and part of that there's gaps. If standards provide that sort of making law more of a living, breathing, evolving feature. And plus, without the bureaucracy, without the adjudicators, voluntarily trying to strive for that, then maybe that's the panacea. But the problem is that's not only not always the case, it's probably not the case most of the time, right? And then that's something that we often don't want from standards in certain cases. And to me, when regulators and legislators talk about standards today as part of the AI governance scheme, they're not thinking about evolving flexible government, but more of this is it. I said the law, and this is the technical. Stick with it, adhere to it. So if standards, if we could sort of reimagine standards at least related to AI or at least certain areas, and try to be creative, maybe even ask ChatGPT, and try to really, so be creative there and somehow move toward that possibility. Definitely, there is some hope there. As of now, I think we're not there yet.
So if I can try to sum up, one of the things about legal approaches is that they mandate a particular technical approach in the law. You have to do it this way. And one, you have to have faith that the government can correctly decide what that way is. And what we discovered is all the technical people, if we were not smart about technology, we'd all go to the beach, shipping pilates, and not trying to work for a living. I don't think anyone's that smart. We're constantly. But the problem is, even if you get it right at the first day, things change. And the law changes slowly. At a minimum, there's a process, whether it's a regulatory process or legislative process. And it's going to be constantly playing catch up. The advantage of standards, practice settings, they're not mandated by law. If the technology changes where it doesn't make sense for us to do it that way, we can change without having to go through the process. So right now, no one has to make equipment manufacturers put Wi-Fi in their phones. Why? Because we know we have a communication, we coordinate around one way to communicate. We all voluntarily do it because it's in our best interest for all of us to be able to communicate. If a new technology came along tomorrow that would do it in a better way, there are no legal obstacles we have to jump through. And if the technology comes along, it will be better. The problem is, we need good standards to do that. And there's nothing, and the process of making good standards is quite a problem. So that's a fascinating problem here, because standards is about design. And right now, we have a bunch of different actors competing to offer different standards right now. And we have to figure out how to do it. Now, I want to turn back to you on a different question, which is, you hear a lot about AI software. And I particularly agree that this is a major part of the debate. I'd love that we started to have a conversation. What do you think the benefits are of AI software? What do you think of the risks? I mean, you've seen both sides of this debate. What do you think?
I'm going to talk in Korean for the benefit of them. So talking about sovereignty, so AI 기본이니까 우리나라 말이겠습니다. AI 기본이라는 말이 무조건 나쁘다, 좋다 말하기 어려울 것 같습니다. 어떻게 하느냐에 따라서 달라질 것 같은데 이렇게 생각해 보시면 좋을 것 같아요. 두 가지 측면이 있는 것 같습니다. 한 가지 측면은 통제, 컨트롤인 거죠. 내 거, 그러니까 반드시 내가 소유자라는 이런 거 있는 게 아니고 이걸 내가 마음으로 할 수 있는 그런 제시 중에 하나가 서비스가 있다. 다른 측면은 뜻이에요. 그러니까 옷을 생각해 보면 내 거가 있는 남이 만들어서 내 것을 쓰는 내가 원하는 걸 할 수 있는 남을 나한테 잘 만들어줘. 남을 잘 만들 수 있는 그래서 이 두 가지 측면이 있는데 지금까지 써버리나 여러 가지 정책적인 포인트들을 보면 많은 경우에 내 거에 많이 있고요. 그러다 보니까 좀 최고 난이도라고 95% 정도라고 이런 얘기가 자꾸 나오는 거죠. 사실은 내 거 이익을 바라는 핏을 나는 나의 수익이야. 남의 옷이면 제가 대단히 못하는데 내 거니까 수익도 하고 짧게 하고 좁히고 늘렸다 했습니다. 그러니까 그런 측면에서 컨트롤 생각을 해야 되는데 그게 결여되어 있는 게 문제고 그게 결여되어 있다면 그러면 AI 주권이 반드시 높지는 않습니다. 그러니까 어떻게 된 거냐면 내 거인 한게 별로 뜻이 안 맞고 내가 안 옷장에 그냥 걸려있는 옷이 돼버리고 그게 이제 최악이 그래서 한 가지 그냥 이걸 보여주는 것 중에 하나가 지금 성능에 대한 얘기가 많아요. 95%거든요. 그것도 약간 이상하긴 하지만 사실 현실적인 목표라고 하더라도 그러면 그게 정말 AI의 기본법을 준수할 95%예요. 또는 정말 우리의 개성과 우리의 원하는 것과 가치를 부합하는 측에 대해서는 아무 얘기 없어요. 95% 된다는 거죠. 그게 과연 핏이 맞는 거지. 그래서 컨트롤을 말씀하실 때 그 목적이 핏에 있으면 좋은 주권인 거고요. 그게 아니면 과연 우리가 그런 주권이 필요한가? 라는 얘기가 뭐냐면 제가 안 맞는 또는 제가 굳이 뭔가 이렇게 전달 안 하고 저한테 잘 맞는 잘 입고 다니고 사람이 칭찬을 하고 어떤 때는 보시고 뭔가 장담하기도 하고 할 수 있거든요. 그러니까 그런 점을 좀 잘 생각하면 좋겠다. 그런데 현재 우리의 너무 결여되어 있는 게 아닌가라는 생각을 합니다.
So that's a fascinating perspective. Nicholas.
I know that it's sort of figured out that there was a really fascinating presentation showing to the AI agency reports about the idea of a with federal digital sovereignty model. Really, it was not just digital sovereignty, but also knowledge sovereignty. The justification for that, I thought was interesting. Do you want a large language model or the switch traditional based on switch line and then their own understanding is that's not all one of the I think that applies to what the problems to talk about, but it's not just that the models that are already values, but the language, there's a little that saying those are going to be our values and our data, our way of life.
I could quickly comment, I mean, there is some recent research out that looks at the values embedded in our language models, and it finds very unsurprisingly most LLMs have been trained primarily and of Western texts from particular Judeo-Christian backgrounds, and unsurprisingly, as a result, our values embedded in them, and those are effective standards. And that is uncovering effective standard values within a certain extent of training data, and that may or may not be representative of the values that are relevant in Korea, China, and other parts of the world. And there's been back to the geopolitical discussion. There are certainly concerns about exporting certain values into other countries, into the supply chain, national security concerns here. So the idea of AI sovereignty, it really touches on a lot of important values. In a real way, it comes back to this question of standards. So I love the example of clothing. Without getting too personal here, we have three goals in the United States. I think on this side of the panel, and I think it's fair to say that our clothes are slightly conservative, shall I say, than our Korean counterparts. There's something embedded in there that we don't necessarily think about that is a de facto representation of something that's very tangible about their culture. And that is something that we need to be aware of. Political context across all industries.
So what Joel in this conversation is getting at is one of the things framing discussion here is that there's an awful amount of standardization. That is, if everyone wants the same thing, you can then standardize around one framework and it can serve everyone. But if what people want differs, and if that's then having a one big solution to everything is the right idea. But there's another problem with this. That's the demand side. It's supply side. So when we talk about AI sovereignty, everyone would like to create AI, you need to understand that it can be chips, everything. I'm sure every country would love to have its own chips, so they can be completely independent and sovereign, supply chain reliable, and money. There are 193 United Nations recognized countries. We will not have 193 chip manufacturers. Why? There's not enough volume, there's a scale economy issue. So the problem of customization is it is costly. And if there's not enough demand for your particular version, you're not going to get it. And so there's a trade-off that constantly happens. When I think about it in this context, we have to think about, in fact, where you do that and how to
Just one quick question. That when you have a wonderful because if we create our own sovereign model, it's not going to have a market for this country. I mean, if that's the market, it's not going to be good. It's not just too damaged, I should say. It's just too expensive to create a 95%, frontier model just for the Korean market. You have to export it. If you want to export it, then it can be Korean program. Sorry. If the bid has to fit the US, so and I guess one saving grace here is that K-pop is going to be maybe our bid is the global bid, right? So, but without thinking of that and saying that okay, we're going to go with it, we feel that our values not only pop, but our values will be the K standard from the head, then we have a viable business case. If not, you do not want to do. So that's another thing that's important.
And I think something that we understand well is if you look at the revolution of the 1960s, it was a shift to an export promotion model. That the way that Korea uplifted itself has become a miracle that most people recognize. is because they didn't confine themselves to domestic market and really look at something like this.
Yeah, I think, no, for the fascinating point that for raised, I think there is we still consider some shifting trend because until last year, everybody talked about foundation model and it was very significant agenda for everybody to have their own clinics LLM on their assets. But now, a more important thing is to maintain access to state of art LLMs and then exploit our domain technology and idea to right, different elements and connect them to effectuate some agent model or other kinds of augmented LLMs. So, now trend is changing, and I think our potential of subordinate and effectively something with our broader digital agenda to play our own role in global supply chain, especially led by the United States and our access to state of art LLM.
Well, we're over time, and I want to say that I would like to claim that we have answered all the questions and given a cyclical solution to all these problems. But that's not feasible. The good news is we're going to do Cyclone again next year, so there'll be something else for us to talk about in the future. With that, please join me in thanking the panelists for the
바꾸려고 하는데요. 항상 사이코 외에 마칠 때 감사 말씀을 몇 차례 드립니다. 우선 우리 패널리스트들에게 또 원고 패널리스트 thank you so much 이렇게 멀리 미국에서 국내에서 바쁘신 가운데 오셔서 정말 즐거운 지식적인 그다음에 창의적인 참여를 한 것 같고요. 그다음에 두 번째 감사는 여러분들이 이렇게 많은 성원 이렇게 오셔가지고 또 저희에게 힘을 많이 주시고 또 같이 이 모임에 참여해 주셔서 깊이 감사드리고요. 그다음에 가장 중요한 건 저기 뒤에 박스 안에 계신 통역사님들과 저 뒤에 있는 테크니컬 센터와 특히 이 모든 것이 연구원들, 학생들, 제자들 보면 유한해졌습니다. 감사의 말씀 드리고, 크리스토퍼의 말씀하신 대로 사이버 리서치 이후 다시 찾아오겠습니다. 여러분, 감사합니다.